preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to our Human Mind series. My name is Susan Engel, and I direct the Adult Division in the Center for Adult Life and Learning. I'm so glad to see so many of you here on this cold winter evening, and I want to commend you all for coming out. In the spring, we will be continuing this series in April with Dan Goleman of the New York Times, discussing his recent book called Emotional Intelligence. And in May, Chicago University professor Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi will be talking on creativity and optimal experience. And now for tonight, the subject being the human mind and history, as our guest has entitled his most recent book, The Axemaker's Gift, a double-edged history of human culture. And our guest this evening, as you know, is Robert Ornstein, who co-wrote this book with James Burke to explore how man, the most innovative and brilliant animal, can also be so destructive. He's also working on a new book on the two halves of the brain, which he'll be discussing with us this evening. In addition, Robert Ornstein is the author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Psychology of Consciousness, The Healing Brain, and Healthy Pleasures. He also heads the Institute for the Study of Human Knowledge in Los Altos, California. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Robert Ornstein.
Good evening. Let me tell you something that actually happened to a friend of mine, a psychiatrist friend of mine, had a patient named Alfred who ran a robotics company, and he got a phone call one day, Stanford professor, that his patient was up on Skyline Boulevard threatening to commit suicide. My friend said to me when he called, well, I'm just a psychiatrist, what do I know about suicide? But the police kind of insisted that since he was this guy's psychiatrist, that he ought to go and see him. He went up. There he passed Alfred's car parked in the road and a whole bunch of cop cars. Alfred then saw him and he tried to talk to him. And he said, Alfred, your robotics company is doing so well. Why do you want to kill yourself? And Alfred said, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to go and do it. And you're just about to get together with your wife again after all this trouble, and you're reconciling with your daughter. Why do this now? And Alfred said, no, I thought it through rationally. I'm positive what I want to do. I know what's going to happen, and I think it's the right thing to do. Whereupon my psychiatrist friend started looking very carefully at his shoes, trying to think of what he could say next. But then something happened. A policeman who was driving by unconnected to the event drove up and stopped and noticed Alfred's car parked, and he ran out and he yelled into this assembled group, having no idea what's happening, who's the, as Richard Nixon used to say, expletive deleted, who left his Pontiac double parked out on the road. And of course, the reason we're hearing this story is that it was Alfred who got down from his suicide perch, got into his Pontiac wagon, parked it neatly by the side of the road, and then quietly got into the car with my psychiatrist friend to get taken to Stanford Hospital. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen every day, but it did happen, actually. But one of the things this and a lot of other less unusual events, I think, show us is that there are a lot of ways of reaching people and a lot of things that go on in people's minds that a lot of our psychology and psychiatry are very unaware of. We have a model of the mind, I think most of us do, in our minds, and usually it's held to be a kind of very exact, rational one. Things work in a certain order, things operate in a certain order, etc. But the mind has actually been as hard to understand for psychologists and psychiatrists as Alfred's suicide was for this psychiatrist. It's been quite clear that most of us have had very little idea of what motivates people, how people think, and how we operate, although we have a lot of different ideas. Part of the reason is that we have a very simplistic view of ourselves, our own nature, and other people's nature. The mind just doesn't have a neat organizational chart. It doesn't come in a neat set of packages, and it wasn't organized by anybody, least of all us. I can tell you, for having looked at this subject for many years, it's a mess in there, really. That basically what we have is not a single entity, but lots of talents, lots of different abilities, lots of different voices. They're all yelling for control. They're all yelling to get out. They're all yelling to do things. And a lot of people have tried to understand this in a lot of different ways. The Freudian analysis is a very famous one, which I think set some of the modern world on a look at how the mind gets organized. But the mind is very hard to grasp, it's very hard to catch, and it's very hard to understand. And part of the reason is it isn't actually organized, as anyone who's ever tried to understand themselves will know. Our minds are not at all organized for self-understanding. Our minds are organized to defeat self-understanding. The job description of the human mind is not really one, in the most part, for most people doing most things, for self-reflection and self-understanding. The mind's job is to get action. The mind's job is to do a few things well and forget about the rest. And the great achievement, I think, and part of the first half of this lecture will be about the Axemaker book that James Burke and I have just finished. Part of what we don't really understand, and part of what none of the analyses that we've looked at previously have shown, is the tremendous role that our culture, our tools, and our civilization have had in actually limiting, directing, and organizing our thought processes. It's my contention that unless actually we understand how well drilled and how well trained we are in doing a few things well in order and not other things in some orders, that we won't really understand what's going on. Now, I don't teach. I just sit home and write books and talk to people. But that doesn't mean I haven't grown up in the academic world, so we have to have the exam. And I thought I would have the exam now, early enough in this, so that if any of you don't do so well, we can talk about it later. First thing is it possible to get a little more light on the audience in there? A little more? Great. Oh, good. There are people there. Hi. My first question is, I presume that all of you are very educated people. Is that right? Is anybody here who's not? Okay. Right. All right. Now, there are a couple of concepts that I think you all know that I just want to be sure about, okay? Now, do you all know alphabetical order? If I asked you to say the alphabet straight through, can you do it? Would you? No. Come on, try it. Okay, fine. What about the months of the year? Do you know what the months of the year are from January to December? Does anybody not know? If there's anybody who doesn't know, they could be excused from the next question. All right, what are the months of the year from January to December? Did anybody need coaching? What are the months of the year in alphabetical order? Did any of you find it easier than doing it in the January to December order? Okay. It's surprisingly hard, isn't it? Even though we, I think, clearly established that you knew what alphabetical order was, and you knew what the months of the year were. Now, if you were a simple computer, you would have no trouble. It would just be a simple sort, the way you would alphabetize a list of files or a list of things in it. There'd be no difference between going from January to December and going from whatever to whatever. I still haven't actually learned it. Now, we don't learn what we don't need to learn. And these prods really into reality, where we can do a few things well, sort of where we touch the world at a few points, is the way our minds really work. We kind of touch the world the way a cat's whiskers will touch a room. You'll have some sense of what's going on. There is some substance and reality to it, but in fact, no one would say that touching a room with a couple of whiskers would give you an adequate picture of the room. The main point is it would be good enough, not any better. The human mind, just as your problems, and they're the same as mine. And have you ever, by the way, tried to remember what the letters are on a touch-tone telephone that go with, say, the 7? Now, again, it's something you've looked at thousands of times in your life. But you've had no reason, generally, unless you're one of these people who makes up an 800 number, like 800 big deal or whatever it is, to know, what the D is, what the L is, and whatever. We don't know what we don't need to know, because basically the mind is not a thoughtful organ. The mind is an action organ, which is only interested in what it needs to do next. This is in general. Now, the enterprise in which probably all the speakers are involved in, and I'm involved in, and you're involved in, is a seriously unnatural act, that people are not actually very well equipped to understand what they're about. And the human mind itself is about the most unnatural mind in the world, as it's been made up of our inheritance and a lot of our nature, more by our nature than any other organism. I mean, imagine, you could have learned Japanese, you could have learned Swahili, you could have learned Bantu, you could have learned all those languages in youth, and unless a few of you have actually grown up in those cultures, learning it now would be a complete disaster. It's because the mind gets organized in each locale to live in a very small area. You learn a certain language, you learn a certain set of rules, you learn, if someone says you're supposed to be somewhere at 7 o'clock, you know that if you're, say, at an airport, 7:01 is too late. If you're in Rio, probably 3 in the morning is probably too late if somebody says come at 7 in the evening. But you learn how to live in these different worlds. What most of the analyses that we've got of the mind to date concentrate on are either the biological endowment, evolutionary principles and biases, others on learning and the family, and still more on cognitive networks, etc. What's always bothered me, and the reason that this is a lecture that's kind of in between two books, what's bothered me about all of that is that it ignores the tremendous contribution of our cultural and technical history, which has in fact made us think in a lot of ways the way we do. By the time you will see, after some of the things I've got to say, by the time you get to being able to read and read English, your mind is already changed radically from what it could have been. So that growing up in the kind of world that we live in automatically has changed the way we can possibly think for the rest of our lives. It's been wonderful for the most part, without the kind of orderly abilities to do all the things that we know how to do, you can imagine what it would be like. I mean, things would be fairly dark and quiet. I'll give you a taste of it now. I can't make it cold enough, but this is what the evening would be like. Okay. You wouldn't really have much going on without the products of our civilization and our society. Let me read to you, since a lot of people have asked me what the Axemaker books is about. What I'm going to do is read you the beginning of it, which explains it, and then go on to a new view of the way the human mind works. The people who gave us the world in exchange for our minds are the Axemakers, whose discoveries and innovations over thousands of years have gifted power in innumerable ways. To emperors they gave the power of death, to surgeons the power of life. Each time the Axemakers offered a new way to make us rich or safe or invincible or knowledgeable. We accepted the gift and used it to change the world. And when we changed the world, we changed our minds, for each gift redefined the way we thought, the values by which we lived, and the truths for which we died. And because each Axemaker's gift was irresistible, not evil or ugly, we always came back for more, unmindful of the cost. Each time there was no choice but to adapt to the effects of the change that followed. This has been true for every generation of our ancestors since the process began well over 1 million years ago. When we used the first tool to cut more food from nature than nature was ready to offer, we changed our future. As a result, there were soon many more of us. As our numbers grew, so did the power of those who could wield the axe most effectively. They became leaders. Most of the rest of the group followed the axe. At first, the effect of the new tools on the world was insignificant. Early human beings lived in small, widely scattered groups, and with their hand axes and spears, they often hunted and harvested their local area until it was empty, at which moment they moved on. The earth was once so rich and so vast that for a long time the damage caused by the indiscriminate axe was not worth consideration. But by about 12,000 years ago, this had already changed. The number of people and tools had reached a critical mass, and our presence began to make itself more widely felt. The rate of change accelerated. The end result of that process can be seen in any crowded third world city street today. Whereas 12,000 years ago there were 5 million of us, today the same number is born every 2 weeks. By the year 2100, the effect of this growth on the body of the planet may well bring the irreversible loss of half the species on Earth. But today, as a result, we in the industrialized nations are healthier, wealthier, better fed, more informed, and more mobile than anybody ever. That progress has also brought a measure of devastation in its wake should not surprise us. Only rarely, if ever, did we look back to examine the effect of our passage on the world, because progress always led us forward towards the horizon we never expected to reach. And it is only now, in the remains of journey's end, that we have begun to question why we have the difficulties we now have. But who are these Axemakers anyway? Originally, they were ancient hominids who had the talent to reshape stones one piece at a time, and in doing so, create tools that would chop up the world. This axe-making ability to do things in the proper order is one of the brain's many natural talents. These talents become active whenever anybody moves gracefully or calculates the arc of a thrown ball or matches the pitch of a sound to movement on a keyboard. But different minds attain prominence in different worlds, and the Axemaker talent for performing the precise sequential process that shaped axes would later give rise to the precise sequential thought that would eventually generate language and logic and rules that would formalize and discipline thinking itself. As the Axemakers changed us and the world with their tools, they also radically changed the way we all perceive the world. The tools changed the physical shape of the human brain. Over millions of years, the process of evolution selected the fundamental brain structure we have had for thousands of years, adept at detecting the bits of the world most useful for survival and reproduction, at least in the type of environment we had when the brain evolved. And while you can't, Axemakers is, you could say as a joke, all of history in one metaphor. That is to say, the important thing about humanity as opposed to every other animal is that we're able to do things in sequence. We're able to work in a certain order. In doing so, like remembering the months of the year in their proper order, we can handle certain orders, but we can't handle lots of other orders. Being able to learn one language like Japanese, Sanskrit, Swahili, Serbo, the various Serbo-Croatian languages means that you don't learn other things. Human beings are the most diverse small-time animals ever existed. We're terrific at living in any small area. We're unbelievably bad at living on a planet that has 5.5 billion people. We're just not any better organized for doing it naturally, and we haven't learned to do it naturally any better than our dogs, cats, or monkeys have learned to do it. In fact, you could say that we're a lot worse. The way we've gotten to do it has been a long process of selecting a certain set of talents, the sequential verbal organizing talents, from the very large gene pool of humanity. These are talents that I think we now know are predominantly organized by the left hemisphere of the brain. They're the talents that have to do with rational thinking, logical thinking, and so on. And doing this was an amazing occurrence in human history. We learned 12,000 years ago to start making notations about the world on carved bones called batons. We learned 3,000 or 4,000 years ago to develop things that we think of as totally normal, like counting. To separate, for instance, the number of things from the quantity of things. The human endowment is much more simple in terms of speech, writing, and mathematics than our learned abilities. The innate understanding of quantity that people have, which you can see in almost all primitive tribes all over the world, people tend to reckon in 1, 2, and lots. That is to say, if it's more than 2, there are occasional tribes that have a concept of 3. But 1, 2, many, or 1, 2, 3, and an awful lot seems to be how it works. So if you ask a Veda tribesman in Sri Lanka who is counting coconuts, he will assign 1 stick to each coconut, and if you say how many coconuts are there, he will pick this number of sticks up and say many, but it's that many. He doesn't need to know that there are 56 coconuts. Shepherds all over the world, when their sheep go in and out during the day, will assign 1 stone to each sheep, putting it down when the sheep go out, picking it up when the sheep go back. So again, there are lots of ways around it, but mostly we don't work that way. In Mesopotamia, not very long ago, in terms of the way the mind works, but very long ago in terms of what's called human history, people began to separate out symbols for the number of things and symbols for the quantity of things. And gradually, this was one of the inventions that made sequencing things a lot easier. Again, you can sequence the number of buttons you push for a telephone dial, and you can again learn that very well. But you also don't remember what the letters are. Again, you've learned this little routine. It's like the kind of glories of humanity are like a whole bunch of little performing trained animal acts that we tend to think, because we are doing the judging and we are talking to each other, that these are terrific things. But in fact, they're just little animal acts. The same thing happened, or in a much more elaborate and much more amazing way, with language. When the first tribesmen started to write down things about phases of the moon good areas for planting, etc. They just wrote on carved bones or whatever, and they wrote any way they wanted. They wrote in circles. They write around the shape of things. They write in straight lines back and forth. They write radiating out from the center. They write really the way kids write. And if you didn't tell any kid how he's supposed to write or she's supposed to write, they could write like this. They could write like that. They could write up and down, etc. But one amazing accident happened on the road to getting here, and that is when the notational system got more and more simplified from having the thousands of pictures from the scribal schools of Mesopotamia to the hundreds of pictures later on to a very cumbersome syllabary in the Canaanite and Proto-Hebraic languages. All of a sudden, about 900 BC, maybe 800 BC, a simplified alphabet got developed by the Phoenicians. It was a kind of Western Semitic language, again, a language that sort of gave rise to modern Hebrew, and much later, about 1,000 years later, to modern Arabic. Modern Arabic is about 500 AD, so it's a much newer language than Hebrew. But somebody decided that they would cut the alphabet down to only the letters that would be abstract, and that word meaning based on these combinations of different letters would be the important thing. The Greeks stole it from the Phoenicians, probably in 800 or 900. And again, we tend to think that our modern world, and we rightly, is the Greek world, the classical Greek world, where logic first got developed, where philosophy first got developed, where modern science first had its roots. Even modern theater, if you look at Medea, for instance, which is a play about an individual trying to grope with her problems in life, not about the gods controlling these little puppets, you see there's a big break into the modern world in Greece. And again, it's no accident that it happened when the Greeks got the alphabet. And there was one more accident. Remember, I said to you that people normally, in an unconstrained way, just as you would start any language and babble anything you want, and children, as you know, who are separated from each other, start their own languages, or some have done it. So it's very easy for us to do this, just like it would be very easy for us to write this way, that way, etc. And the Greeks used to write in something called, what's now called boustrophedon, which is a quite good way to write, by the way. It's sort of like this, and then back like this. Those of you who've had computers and have had an older dot matrix printer know that it's a very fast way that it prints. It'll go back and forth each line. The only difference is the dot matrix printer will actually hold the line in memory and print it backwards, so you keep reading it the way we normally read it. It seems very natural for us to read from left to right. In about 700, the Greeks, soon after they got their alphabet, they started putting vowels in their language, which made it possible for somebody who didn't know what was being talked about to know what was being said. With a language without vowels, there are so many words that could mean lots of different things. The language is actually like poetry. So that unless you've had a long series of training in what's being said, it's very difficult to decipher. But modern English is very easy to decipher. Most of the modern Western languages are, because everything is specified. It's all on the page. So they took what is really the right hemisphere, as I'll get to later, component out of language, and they made it fully specified. And all of a sudden, people found that they preferred to write this way. If you're out there this way, it's like this, right? Left to right. As soon as that happened, several things happened. We got philosophy. We got democracy. We got all sorts of things that just didn't happen before. It was one of these amazing accidents of history that completely changed the way modern thinking existed. And that's because it made it easy for us to learn and associate the shapes of the written language with the sounds of the written language when we were still growing up. 26 characters is not a big deal to learn. Even now, some of the languages that, even when they're simplified, Japanese, as you know, takes 3 or 4 more years of schooling to learn, and Japanese schooling is much, much, much more stressful and much harder than Western schooling because their language is so hard to learn. I tried it for a week and, and gave it up. Now we tend to think, that prose is prosaic and poetry is poetic, but in fact, the Greeks started to use poetry as soon as they got the alphabet as a kind of a database, as a sort of spreadsheet for information about what was going on. And it was only after Aristotle that prose became so important. It caused an immediate revolution in the way we thought about matter. Democritus decided that there were atoms because all matter would get made up of individual constituent particles, the way that words got made up of individual constituent particles. And so physics, although it took a while, moved along the line. We got the external data storage system that we need. Moving left to right has another consequence, which I think is more important and is the key to the accident. When you move your eyes from the left to the right, you're using your left hemisphere to do it. When you move your eyes in that way, the visual field that your eyes are encompassing takes the information into the left hemisphere. For a long time, it's been known that the left hemisphere is specialized for this kind of sequential stuff. That's the way it seems to work, and that's the way it operates. Recently, I think a lot of us have found some very startling things. One, when did this happen? Did it happen at the time of the Greeks? There was a theory by Julian Jaynes, who created a great splash a couple of years ago, saying that consciousness and this whole way of thinking came about during the time of the Greeks. But in fact, while it was a major revolution, you can find differences in the way the hemispheres work in the rat that are the same as the way the hemispheres work in human beings. That is, the left hemisphere of most rats is specialized for doing things in sequence, and the right hemisphere is specialized for doing things all at once. So we can't any longer say that this particular thing is very late in human history. It's just been a great accident. And I think you could say it's not like the famous story of all the monkeys in the British Museum that they would all eventually type out, or one of them would eventually type out letter perfect, the complete works of Shakespeare, just by chance, just give them enough time. But with all the societies that have ever operated and all the developments that ever happened, I believe this is one of these things that just had to happen. That one day society would organize, a culture would organize a way of dealing with language that happened to fit the brain perfectly. Sort of the way people make fortunes. The guy who made a fortune with selling a spreadsheet program for a computer, it just happened to fit perfectly. You might have had the computer around for another reason. You might have taken a computer home, for instance, to play video games on it. But once you can deal with a spreadsheet on the computer, you can use it for lots of other things, and it changes the world. And the reason the Greeks changed the world forever is because they were the first society to get enough people organized to a certain left hemisphere way of thinking and organizing things. And again, it's no accident that logic and the rules for marshalling thought came out of it. Since then, there have been two radically different views about how the hemispheres get organized. One from Paul Broca, the great French neurophysiologist who discovered that language speaking and word production was located in the left hemisphere, has been that the left hemisphere is the human being. The left hemisphere is the reason. The left hemisphere is the source of all wisdom and all abilities in humanity. And the other hemisphere, the right, is just a kind of appendage, an automaton that might have a few things to do. But when you see people with right hemisphere damage, you don't see that they are amazingly impaired. That is, if you've seen people with serious left hemisphere damage, either a stroke or an injury, they often can't talk at all. Sometimes they can understand speech, but they can't produce it. Sometimes they can produce it, but they can't understand it, which is much worse because they get a kind of word machine run amok. It's a kind of schizophrenic word salad. But people with right hemisphere damage can get along, they can speak, they can deal with the world in a fairly ordinary way. But they can't always do some other things, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But they don't look nearly as bad. It's definitely a lot worse to have left hemisphere damage. And as you probably know, there's been a lot of movement to, well, if we could only get into our right hemispheres, the world would be a better place, and we can all relax and do all of that. So I'd like to read you a few things. As you know, the 60s were filled with this. The inherent and universal tendency to give preferential use to the right hand is one of the worst imaginable things. I have, by bringing my bimanual powers to such a pitch, being able to exist on only 3 hours sleep after 24, out of 24. Thus, from the hour of awakening until 4:30 p.m., I can spend most of my time in ordinary right-handed activities of writing and reading, and from 4:30 p.m. until 3 in the morning, I would perform left-handed exercises. By thus employing alternately the left and the right hemispheres, I have twice the capacity for work of a right-handed individual. Here's another one. The educational system is a failure because through the fault of our fathers and mothers, we make use of only 1/2 of our body for certain acts and 1/2 of our brain for certain other acts. We found that is owing to that defect in our education, that 1/2 of our brain is developed for certain things while the other half of the brain is developed for other things. If children were trained to develop both brain halves, we would have a sturdier and healthier race, both mentally and physically. This is not somebody who wrote in 1974, but the Chancellor's visitor in lunacy, who wrote in 1874. The previous bimanual powers guy was a guy who wrote in 1920. So this sense that if we could only liberate both sides of the brain, everything would be fine, is not a kind of 60s reaction to the excesses of society, but it's something that lots of people have always tried to do. The systematic teaching of ambidexterity, this man John Jackson and his followers promised Britain could look forward to a brave new world of two-handed, two-brained citizens with untold benefits for health, education, handicraft, sports, schoolwork, industry, and the military. Each hand shall be absolutely independent of the other in the production of any kind of work whatever. If required, one hand shall be writing an original letter and the other shall be playing the piano, with no diminution in the power of concentration. This was John Jackson in 1905. So people have always wanted this to happen. What I want to conclude this lecture by saying is that the modern analysis of the mind has come a long way. In the early part of the 20th century, after the First World War, and after the unprecedented horrors of that war, a lot of social workers, a lot of educators, and a lot of brain physiologists were beginning to to think deeply about how can human beings become perfected. Some of these comments I've just mentioned to you were part of it. The reigning theory in neuropsychology and neurophysiology was what you might call a single and equal brain for everybody. And the idea was that any part of anybody's brain could be trained to do anything in anybody if you just did it. So you had John Watson saying, give me basically an ant and I'll turn him into an Einstein, or whatever he actually said. As things moved along in the study of the cerebral hemispheres that Roger Sperry started and David Gallen and I and other people worked on in the 70s, we began to think of the mind as having these two different systems. It's not like I once had a dream that somebody on television had asked me, well, which really is the good hemisphere and which really is the bad hemisphere? I'm very confused, Dr. Ornstein. But obviously neither of them are good or bad. They just do different kinds of jobs. But it's only now, with a look at the evidence of the last 30 years, and there are in my recent review of hemisphere function, I did a search. Computers are absolutely wonderful for this. I did a search of all the studies done on what's called laterality or cerebral asymmetry since 1966, and there are 44,300 articles done in this area. So it's a serious amount of research, except for AIDS, there's the most research on laterality of absolutely anything in the literature. Given that, we have a much better idea of what goes on. And let me read you something that will give you an idea of what the right hemisphere does. Because, as you can see from the analysis in Axemakers, a kind of untrammeled sense of just going on and cutting up the world, doing more and more things, is not really a very comfortable way for humanity to proceed. It's sort of like ordering out a pizza and saying, well, let's have anchovies. Okay, let's have anchovies, let's have olives. What about pineapple? That sounds good. Let's put pineapple on the pizza. What about ham? That's okay. Let's have ham. Let's have candied orange peel. Okay, we'll put that on the pizza, etc. If you keep doing things to any given situation, even one as simple as a pizza, your consequences are going to be about as unintended as the guy who came in to try to deal with Alfred. You won't really know what you're doing. You may have a very good result. On the other hand, you may have an equal and disastrous result. I don't have the picture here, and this man is not my favorite artist, and it's probably just as well that I'm going to read this to you. A number of people are sitting in this study looking at a Norman Rockwell painting. Why they used a Norman Rockwell painting and not a photograph, I have no idea. This is an unpublished study, so I don't have the picture, although I know the painting exists somewhere, but you'll get it. Here's a non-brain damaged response to the painting. That is a person like most of us here, maybe not everybody. It's people waiting in a waiting room for a doctor to look after them. One man has a bandage. The little boy is quite tense. He's sitting with his legs very close together and his hands held. And the third person is tense too. He is leaning over, and they're all waiting to be called. Now, maybe some of you know the painting, but I think for everybody, it gives you a very good idea of what it is. People who've got right hemisphere damage, but who otherwise, as I said, they look pretty good. They can get around in the world, they can talk, they can read. Well, it might be a baseball game. They all seem so interested. Another guy. These two boys are, perhaps their father or their uncle has a bandage around their head, possibly returned from a war. They could be sitting in a church pew. The boys have very serious thoughts on their mind, I suppose wondering what their fate might be. Another person later. They're at the movies maybe, and they're watching a moving picture, probably an action picture. Another person. There are 3 people, I think, waiting, sitting on a bench. An older man. He probably has a bandage on his head. And the boy in the middle has his hand clenched in his lap. He's wearing blue shorts, white shoes with striped socks. And the man at the end of the bench is wearing leather shoes. And the boy at the end of this bench, I guess he's between the 2 of them in age. And he has a cigarette tray right by him. And he looks a little anxious. He's got his elbows on his knees. He's got his chin in his hand. He's wearing a khaki suit. The boy's wearing a short-sleeved shirt, blue shorts. The man's wearing a dark suit with a tie, and the man has a bandage on his head. Okay? Now here's the left hemisphere telling you absolutely everything about what's happening, except what's happening. You know, the normal person says it's people waiting in a waiting room. Now this guy has described absolutely everything about the situation except what it's about. And it's about as good an example of the way these systems work as anything. People with right hemisphere damage don't get jokes. They don't get jokes because in order to get a joke, you have to have an idea of what people are going to be talking about. They don't get the gist of examples. They don't actually know what's happening. They can follow their own lines through life, but they don't know what's going on. They're very bad at switching hypotheses. Now, you heard this guy listing everything about this situation, but it's like describing, for good or bad, this lecture in the sense of, well, somebody's wearing a green sweater and somebody's wearing this, and there are boards on the floor, and there are, what is the relevant detail here? What is going on? What are we doing? What is happening? That's what this long, long period of research on the right hemisphere has, I think, finally gotten us to. That it's the right hemisphere that, if you take the kind of view of the mind that Howard Gardner and I and other people have had, that the mind is a collage of talents. It's sort of like facing you. It's a crowd of different abilities all going around. For a long time, some of the people, especially those who are interested in computer sciences, have said, well, you don't need an organizer or a controller. All you really need to understand the mind is what are these talents, etc. But I think we're beginning to understand that it's the right hemisphere that really is running the show. It's sort of like the coach of the team. It's the one that's going to pick the reaction out of all the things. Some various people with a lot of different kinds of brain damage are not damaged because they can't do things. They're damaged because they don't know what to do. And I submit to you that in a sense we're a little bit like that in dealing with the monster that humanity has become. That we're a little bit like it in dealing with this huge juggernaut of 5.5 billion people doing thousands and thousands of things. And we're like that because we're all learning the kind of vocational education we get, which is how to do one thing, how to go from January to December, but not how to go in any other order. We're very good at drill and practice. We've learned it well enough. What we're not good at is switching. One other small example of the kind of research that's being done on this, in one study, both left and right hemisphere people were asked, hemisphere damaged people were asked, follow this story. George went to interview the celebrity was sure to take his pen and pencil, pen and paper. Okay. Now, most people who read that sentence think that George is, I'm sorry, I blew it. Okay? You'll have to forgive me. My right hemisphere got ahead of me. The story is George went to see the celebrity, and took his pen and paper with him. Most people think he's an autograph hound. The next line in the story is the discussion about the effects of nuclear power was very interesting, and George made a lot of notes for his newspaper. Okay, so now you have a very different idea of who George was, why he took his pad with him, right? Most people who are normal or even left hemisphere damage don't mention in describing the story anything about being an autograph seeker. But people who are right hemisphere damaged can't get rid of this hypothesis. They can't get it out of their mind because the first hypothesis is that this guy is going out to look for autographs. They can't switch their reactions. So it's that ability to pick out of the enormous range of talents that are innate in the human being and the very great range of them that we develop that the right hemisphere seems to excel at. And it is probably this ability, which is certainly one that has been and is trained in lots of philosophical, esoteric, and religious systems. That is, how to know who you are, how to know what the meaning of your life is, how to know what to do with your life, how to know when to do what, how to know when to be quiet, when to be noisy, when to get angry, etc. It's all of those things, not what to do, but when to do what, that the right hemisphere seems to be organizing. Why it's like that, I have no idea. It's been a great surprise to me to find, after going through all this stuff, that in fact, instead of having a mind where we've got lots of individual talents that aren't coordinated, that in fact there is a really seriously highly developed coordination system, and that it's a system that does get developed in various cultures that are very different than ours. So for instance, Chinese people who don't have the same kind of written language that we do don't have the same kind of brain specialization that we do. Brain damage to the left hemisphere of Chinese people does not interfere with Broca's area. In fact, there's some question in the literature whether there is a Broca's area in people who learn Chinese from birth in a culture where that's the main language. That's changing, of course, because more and more people are learning English and German and these kind of languages. But it seems like this experiment, you might say, that started in Greece 2,500 years ago and has brought us this amazing richness, has also brought us to the end of just doing this, and that more and more people, I think, are going to have to look to other kinds of talents in their brain, especially those of coordination and combination that the right hemisphere seems to do. It seems to be able to connect us up to things in each other and to the world and to our life in a way that I don't think most of us had thought until recently. So that's the juncture that I'm at right now in between these two pieces of work, and I just thought I'd like to let you know where I was. Thank you very much. If any of you have questions, I'll be happy to take it. And I've been drilled into saying I must repeat the question, so you don't have to speak very loud. Which side is memory? Well, I think memory is one of, not everything is in one side or another. That's the first thing I'd like to say. And the second thing is I think memory is one of the great myths about the nature of the mind. I think there's almost no real memory that exists in us. In fact, what there is, it's certainly true that we change with experience, that as things happen, we're very different. But we don't really, strictly speaking, remember much about the world. What we do is we make up versions of what happened in the past continuously, based on the changes that have existed in us, which makes it possible, for instance, for psychotherapists to, for instance, convince people that anything happened. And it makes it also possible for us to tell ourselves wonderful stories about our own life. But memory is a lot more like what happens when you work out with weights or something. You wouldn't say that your bicep remembers the dumbbell, but you could say that after having contact with the dumbbell, the bicep is different and it can operate differently. So something happens differently in us based on our experience, and we're different after that. We may be stronger, etc. In the same way, much of that goes on in the brain. There are verbal memories, however, that do seem to exist, that exist, again, where verbal production exists in the left hemisphere. There are motor memories and motor routines that are learned that exist in other areas. But memory isn't a thing that is separate from anything else. It's not separate from perception. It's not separate from learning. These are like chapter headings in introductory psychology textbooks. They don't have any real meaning. Take it from somebody who wrote one. Sir?
Yes, why if the left side of the brain was developed for practical, pragmatic, immediate action, maybe not culture, why in turn weren't we born left-handed?
Why weren't we born? Okay, the question is if...
Been more coordinated, a lot easier, and a lot more practical.
Well, the question was, why, if the left hemisphere is organized for immediate practical action, why shouldn't we all be born left-handed, and wouldn't it be better? The answer to the question, the simple answer to the question is yes and no. Yes, because it would be better if the fibers would just go down and control the hand. No, because again, we didn't get designed. I mean, the way we all ask these questions is if it's like saying, why don't we change the dial on this radio so it has better markings? You know, that's kind of the way we kind of think of it. But God never really had the money to do a good enough job on us or our ancestors. There was budget cutbacks. You know, there were lots of problems. I mean, nobody would have designed us with the kind of lower back pain and varicose veins that we have if anybody had had the money to do a proper job. Part of the reason for it, I think, has to do more with protection against damage. That if, for instance, the cells controlling one side of the body were on the same side of the body, some predator who would, say, damage this side of the body over here, say, would also knock out this side of the body's ability to respond. You can easily see that since you don't need a big difference in evolution to make a difference, that having the other side available for controlling this side would save some animals' lives. So it would be a lot better, I think, to have a system where you have what's called contralateral control, where you control this side with this, so that if there was damage over here, you'd still have other half side to handle this with it. That's probably one of the reasons. But what happens is, like a stream making a slight turn very early in its life, these small changes at the beginning of a big system, like a weather system or whatever, eventually build on each other, and with countless generations, things move. Sir, yes, you.
Could you speak to the propensity to choose evil over good? Whether it's some structural influence that caused the latter to the former?
Could I speak to the propensity to choose evil over good and whether there's any structural component to it? Well, it's not my hobby myself to choose evil over good, so I don't have a lot of experience of it. But, and it doesn't actually have very much to do with my subject, but I'll only say a few things. One is, there's no question that some number of people, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 8% of people, are born with a nervous system that just never accepts the society's norms. They don't respond to punishment, they don't get embarrassed, they don't care about things, etc. And I think it's from, if you look at people who are in jail, while there are thousands of other factors, you see that lots of these people have a kind of a very non-responsive autonomic nervous system. And that's a very great boost into being able to do things that other people would consider evil or cruel. Now, if you're going to try to analyze all of humanity for all time in every case, it's both not my subject and beyond anything I can do. But there are some structural components to what you might call being evil, or at least being criminal. Were you scratching your head, or were you asking a question? You're here. You are asking a question. Yeah.
It used to be kind of layman's conventional wisdom that the left brain, at least when I read this, the left brain was a more linear thinking, logical, language-oriented brain, and even in mathematics, it was very much involved in let's say, deductive thinking. And yet, what you said seems to totally repudiate that. In other words, it sounds now as if conceptual thinking all comes from the right side, the understanding and being able to connect things and see reason and purpose. Is this a change in our understanding? Is this recent research, or was that original material that I tell you in quote here? Was that completely myth?
I presume everybody heard the question. The easiest answer to that is all of the above. First of all, these things are not. There's what's called in the neuropsychology trade dichotomania, which is the idea that you will say, well, everything of this is in the left hemisphere and everything of this is in the right hemisphere. And I've been tempted by that more than once myself. Those things don't work very well. It's sort of like saying, do you walk with your left foot or your right foot? Now, you may have a much stronger right foot than a left foot, but it's not like you don't use both. So all the things we do use both. What's old about this view is the sense that the kind of sequential aspects of dealing with the world, which underlie language, but they only underlie certain kinds of language. So for instance, my ability, your ability, and everybody else's ability to speak words in a certain order and to hear them in a certain order is clearly the province of most people's left hemisphere. People with left hemisphere damage cannot do it, certain kinds of left hemisphere damage, and there's no doubt about it. You get people who just talk in a, how the sky, the dog moon I'm seeing falling over, feeling blue, etc. So it might be awfully creative sounding, but in fact, if you keep doing it all the time, you realize that these people have really lost something very serious. To say that there's no sort of creativity and leaps of insight that can't be gained by this kind of what you might call microsystem meaning in the left hemisphere. That is, there's a C, an A, and a T. What does that mean? Okay. Now, is it a BIGCAT? And is it going to EATUS? Or what is going on here? Understanding what the little pieces of the puzzle mean is definitely a left hemisphere ability. What I think is important in this view is understanding the big picture. say, of what we're doing. What are these people doing sitting there with the bandage on his head and the bat, etc.? The normal person says they're in a waiting room. It's not, all of us would have said these are people waiting, probably a long time for a doctor, right? I mean, you understand everything about it. If there's somebody with a syringe, if there's somebody with, there are all sorts of elements that if you don't know what's going on, you will be lost in what often goes for, high-level thought in the academic world. You get, here's a list of everything that's going on in this situation, but nobody has the big picture. So what is new, I think, is a view that it's not language versus non-language. It's not perception versus non-perception. It's an understanding of what you might call meaning, the small meaning of things and the big meaning of things. You can't have the big meaning of things without the small. You can have the reverse. Sir?
Yeah. One of the key components in the discussion of cultural history of humanity is this idea that we got an alphabet and then kind of focused on, or certain parts of our culture focused on reading from left to right strictly. Can you comment on how you feel the effects of other cultures, such as the Hebrew and currently the Arabic, who read from right to left, may be affecting a difference in point of view?
Well, I think it does. I think we were talking to a friend of ours who was from Israel the other day, who was saying that, because Hebrew doesn't have vowels and it doesn't have a lot of the kind of guides that English does, it's often hard to understand exactly what's being said. I mean, you do learn what's being said in the way that you learn how to interpret English. Now, one of the big problems, say, between understanding British people for Americans and understanding and us understanding each other, the idea of divided by a common language is mostly a sense of learning what means what in a certain kind of language. So if you say something in an academic talk in Britain, and I've sometimes sat with Americans, and since I go to Britain a lot and I know a lot of British people, I've learned a little more about their particular way that this tribe speaks. A friend of mine was talking once at Oxford, and he sat down after the talk, and then someone got up and said, "I'm not completely sure that everything in this speech was 100% accurate." So my friend thought he meant, "I'm not completely sure that everything in this speech was 100% accurate, which would be that I agree with most of it, etc." When in fact, what the English person was saying is, "You are a total fool." That's what it means. Now you learn this if you know what goes on in a culture. Now, when you have very highly specified languages, like HAIR means something in English, whereas the H, the A, the I, and the R don't. The Arabic and Hebraic languages especially, it's not only their right to leftness, it's the fact that they don't have vowels and they're not fully specified. They're more like the kind of rich resonance you get in poetry, where a word may be picked because of its crossroads of several different phrases. And these people are forever complaining what an awful language English is. And the line is, maybe it's good for business. Okay? And I think that's true. It's good for business. But business and science has in fact taken over the world, and everybody in the world is busily learning how to do business. And in order to do that, you at least need this, or you need to modify your other languages. So Chinese, for instance, has been radically simplified to deal with the 20th century. In the back there. Yes?
You mentioned the loss of function
Could you be a little more specific?
Well, I'm interested because I work with developmentally,
Sure.
neurologically impaired children
Mhm.
who have not lost function, but basically have not developed certain functions in certain hemispheres. And they are a different population from the population that loses function because of trauma.
Right. Thanks. I presume everybody heard that too. What happens in the brain is a very complicated situation in which most of what goes on during development is that we lose neural connections. It's more like brain development in general. This is for the great bulk of humanity, for the great bulk of time, not for everybody. But you might think of brain development as more like pruning a tree than you would think of growing anything new. And that's because, as I said earlier, you and I and everybody else came into the world with the ability to learn Persian, to learn Norwegian, to learn the click language of South Africa, etc. Learn every language and thousands of other languages that no longer exist, and to make up our own language. We didn't do it. Most of us probably learned English from birth. Some of us may have learned another language and learned a second one. Some of us are bilingual or trilingual. But that's still only a couple of languages out of, let's say, 20,000. And those 20,000 could have been millions. What that means is your ability to do lots of other things in life are lessened. You know, as you'll know if you take up a radically different language when you're an adult. So people normal development is losing function and getting function. Just as when you concentrate on one of your talents, your other ones go away. When the brain gets wired up, the cells in the brain get connected for your life in your little area. It might be New York in the 20th century, which means speaking English, learning to eat a certain kind of diet, living in a certain kind of world. It might be Pondicherry in the 12th century, which would mean an entirely different language, entirely different kind of diet, an entirely different way of looking at time, etc. Once it happens, once we develop, every year as we develop, we have less ability to go back and change. So the important thing for neurologically impaired people is the longer you wait to teach them to do something, the more they lose, because the brain gets wired up as we develop. So in studies where you put, say, an eye patch over one eye, even for one day during development in childhood, that eye will be fundamentally weaker than the other eye. It happened to me. I had a punch in the eye and a piece of glass in the eye, and I had an eye patch over it to protect it. And my left eye, it was 2 days when I was 6 years old, my left eye is much weaker than my right eye and has been forever. It's because during that time, the connections that are being fought inside the brain between the left and the right eye were all getting made by the right eye. So this is what happens to all of us. We don't normally notice it that dramatically, but you can do a number of studies. I've been looking over that way, mostly because I've been trying to use my right hemisphere.
If we would say that one of the most basic functions of the right brain is to give the individual, the organism, a perception of itself. In other words, tell it who it is, what its function is, or give it its point of view. If that is the case, is it biologically imprinted into the functioning of that right brain, or could that perception be changed through cultural aspects or through learning process?
Everybody here over there? No? No. If the function of the right hemisphere is to give the person, his point of view, sense of identity and what he does, is that biologically imprinted or is it changeable by culture or learning processes? It's more changeable than some of the more fixed abilities. It's more changeable than things like sense of balance, ability to recognize things by smell, spatial abilities, etc. It's definitely something that does get developed and get modified birth. And in fact, you could say it's one of the things that gets developed in spiritual and religious traditions. And so it is a lot of what you might call development in adulthood rather than the development in the childhood. And again, it's more along the sense of you have to have all the components in order to do it. If you can't speak and read, and if you can't have a sense of balance, and you can't identify things by smell, and you don't know when to stop eating, and etc., and you're always showing up 3 days late for your work, then you're not really going to get to this other point. So it requires all the other stuff. And this is why you can't really look at the hemispheres and say, well, one's the good guy, one's the bad guy, or one's the this, or one does all the good things, and whatever. This stuff requires all those other talents to work. Sir?
You referred earlier to Julian James. His theories now regarding consciousness, origin of consciousness, ancient Greek revenue?
The question is, what's the status of Julian James's stuff? Julian's stuff was always extremely controversial. And I think it was a kind of brilliant imaginative reconstruction of what could have happened. I don't think as far as I know that anybody really has followed it up to produce much that would support this kind of brilliant conjecture. And I wish more people would try things like it, and that it doesn't seem to have held up too well is not really a criticism, because what science needs more is many more imaginative people. Yes.
I have a friend, a little 10 years old girl, whose left hand, the right index, with the left hand. I started to teach her how to write Russian, and she does it with the right hand. She does it much better. She sits at the table and writes very neatly, although the English is done on the floor. And somebody told me that they might do some damage to the girl's brain, teaching her that. She's very confused about challenge.
The question was, it's a girl who learned English with her left hand and is now 10 and is learning Russian with the right. Since I'm not in a position to examine the child, I would not be able to say exactly, but I'd worry about it. That is, I don't think it's an irrelevant suggestion. I'd certainly look for signs of stuttering or anything like it. If it started, I'd be seriously concerned. But since she's well, if it's a couple of minutes a week, I'm sure that's not going to matter. One or two more. I know I'm being sure. No, one quick question. Would I? No. That's a quick answer.
With all respect to the right and left hemispheres, most of us get out during the day with abstract thinking about whether to communicate well with complex tasks. If I read your writing correctly, you say with every game you have certain losses. And I would like to hear you say something about where consciousness is today relative to the massive social problems that we face in society each day that seem to be overwhelming.
Goodness. How long do you have? It's not really an answerable question. What I've tried to do during this lecture is to give you one view of it, which is to say that the focus on sort of short-term, close to ourselves, easily understandable aspects of the world are things that have certainly got our ancestors and us to an entirely different world. We've built a world that's entirely beyond our biological ability to manage. And if I have anything to say, and I've had anything to say about consciousness in this, is that it needs to shift towards understanding the nature of the larger systems in which we live, where we're basically biased to live we're biologically organized to live in a 200-person village, just about the size of the number of people that that most normal people can easily recognize. A 200-person village where everybody's actions are well accounted for. Now, things that happen all over the world affect us in profound ways, and we don't really have the systems available to do it. And I think that's the dilemma, and I think some of this research on the hemispheres has something interesting to say about it. But I'm supposed to stop now. Thank you. Do you want these? Are you saying?
No.
Okay.
Yes, I just want to thank Dr. Ornstein for being with us this evening. Please join us outside. There are books available for sale, and you can ask further questions. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.